welcome to Knowledge is Power. My name is Ayanna Sloan. I am the host of your program today, and I am here in the audience, or here in our program with a special guest that I want to introduce to you in just a minute. But what I want to just start out first, explain a little bit about why I want to do this particular program. We have been faced with so many issues that seem to be dividing the country, our communities, and even families. And those issues seem to be a lot centering around things like bias, around race, around religion, around gender. There's so many biases that exist within our society. And I wanted us to begin to start having a conversation. First about why we have these biases and how do we understand what bias is. And not only that, but once we do that, how can we begin to overcome or dismantle some of these biases? Because we're supposed to be one nation, indivisible, and yet we keep dividing ourselves into all these different categories. And for me, we kind of continue that by, checking boxes. What box do you belong in? And all these different ways of identifying people that, unfortunately to me, they keep us more separate than they bring us together. So in order to begin to understand some of these larger issues and start having conversations about this, I have invited our very special guest into our studio today. His name is Ryan Waynet. How are you today, Ryan?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to have you here with us today. And Ryan he has this really long title. He'll explain all that to you. But he works for the Underground Railroad Freedom Center here in Cincinnati, Ohio, and it's a very fascinating place. Ryan can tell you a lot more about this. So with that, I want to just turn to Ryan and let him tell you a little bit about who he is and what he does at the Freedom Center.
Well, thank you. So my name is Ryan Waynet. I grew up around Cincinnati and was familiar with the Freedom Center as it was getting off the ground in the late 90s and early 2000s. I never thought I would have a direct role there, but you fast forward a decade after college, and I found myself with some unique insight into cognitive science, and was asked by somebody at the Freedom Center who was a family friend to try to have an idea that could make it more relevant to more people. And I took a while to think about what that might mean, and I remembered some stuff from undergrad about implicit bias, also known as unconscious bias. They're used interchangeably. And I thought, I spent a few years in a PhD in cognitive science pursuing analogy. And so I always see analogies everywhere, and I was kind of looking for the next big thing. And unconscious bias turns out to not be an analogy, it's just the next step, because the Freedom Center's always been in the business of trying to fight discrimination. And until recently, we've only been able to view discrimination from, call it, an above the surface view. The last 30 or 40 years have shown us in the cognitive sciences that what is going on beneath the surface, outside of conscious awareness, is driving problems in society much deeper than we would have thought possible. And so while things like Charlottesville and Ferguson and anybody who watches the news ever has no problem seeing that a lot of classic explicit discrimination is, forgive the phrase, alive and well in this country. Those are still problems, but unconscious bias is the idea that since about 95% of all the energy you have is unconscious, some of the vast majority of problems in society are not just driven by these big, loud, overt acts of the few, but they're driven by the small, subtle, silent biases that we all have, because we're humans, right? These biases do not make us bad people. They make us human beings operating in a very complex world that has to have a brain that has limited resources. So we have to take shortcuts, and we have to develop stereotypes and habits, but these don't have to be, they're not absolutely set in stone, and that's what we're finding out more and more.
So when we talk about the bias, it's not necessarily interchangeable with discrimination, is it? Or do you think it is?
Well, what do you mean interchange? I would say, for me, the big difference between implicit and explicit bias is intent. Implicit bias operates at such a deeper level that you literally cannot intend to have it. Unfortunately, you can't just intend not to have it.
Right.
But that's the big line of demarcation for me, is that with classic discrimination, anti-Semitism, bigotry because you're Muslim or black or gay, these things, people are aware that they're happening, and implicit bias is not that simple, and it's further complicated by you as Ayanna Sloan, as a black woman, can harbor negative associations against black people, against women, right? I mean, like, so it's not as just easy as being able to see black versus white, man versus woman, gay versus straight. Like, it's not as simple as that, because we're human beings before we're anything else. And so these biases they should not be at all thought of as an indictment of your personal character. They can be thought of as more as a reflection of societal values. It's a buildup in your system. Starting at around 2 years of age, these biases start to develop.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's more like how we perceive the world?
Yeah, well, these start to develop. I tell people every day that that to think of implicit or unconscious bias as too cumbersome. I think of it personally as automatic bias. And like we were talking about a minute ago, the reason the brain has outsourced 95% of all the activity in your head is because if you had to sit here and tell yourself to breathe 20,000 times a day and to make 500 million synaptic connections every second, you'd quickly go crazy. So the way we do all these things without even thinking about it is without even thinking about it. And so the brain does a great job of navigating this complex world efficiently and effectively almost all the time. But implicit bias is really no different than the 1 out of 2 people every day that try to walk out of the exhibit at the Freedom Center by yanking on the push door, right? And everybody generally laughs at that because everybody can relate to doing that, right? Why do people immediately go out to yank a door that has a handle, even when it says push exclamation point? Because the vast majority of the time, doors that have handles open in, they pull. So long ago, your brain said, listen, don't even worry about it. I'll take care of it. If it's got a handle, you're going to pull. And the goal of the exhibit is to not try to stop you from having these biases or to try to automatically make you not pull a door with a handle. You're going to. Part of the challenge of what we're doing is being able to put the pause in your thinking to realize that these biases are taking place in the first place. And then trying to go about, like you were mentioning earlier, taking steps to mitigate the influence that they have, right? And there are any number of ways we can try to talk about doing that. A lot of it's been studied, and we're still finding out every week, it seems, the degree to which the brain is malleable later in life. We used to think it was like 18, now we know it's 25, probably later. You can teach old dogs new tricks.
Well, so then listening to you, is it fair to say that implicit biases are learned at some point in life? We have a shorthand way of looking at the world. There's some kind of association. If we see A, we think B. That's simplistic, but that's what we're talking about?
The big things have to be simplistic, and that's exactly what we're talking about. We are not born racist or sexist or whatever. It has to be learned through experience. Traditionally, we think of it as being explicit or direct experience. I can remember being taught, some racist or sexist way of thinking. But what we're realizing more and more is that because for every second that your brain is active, every second of the day, you're being bombarded by about 11 million little bits of information. You can juggle at most 40 of these consciously. Okay, so the rest are being filed away. And the brain is not hardwired to be racist or homophobic. The brain is hardwired to make connections and to use those connections to best predict the way to get you through the world, right? And so the news, all the news, all media is a big part of this because it reinforces these things that can often be, in the case of race, what we're really talking about are class-based distinctions, but because of the way the news cycle works, we often just see it as people will think it's a black thing or a woman thing or something like this, when in reality it's nothing like that. But because the brain has a really difficult time separating out, it doesn't know what's a more important connection. It's just going to make these connections, and so these biases, they often line up with what we believe, but sometimes they don't. And one great example is these tests that I'm sure we'll talk about. They always have 4 categories, and on one of them, it's having you associate men and women with career and home. And it's something like, in the millions of people that have done this test, something like 94% of men have a really easy time associating women at home and men at work. Something like 95% of women have that same difficulty, right? And so it doesn't matter if you're the female CEO of a company or the male stay-at-home dad of the year. These are the associations that are out there in society, and your brain is just collecting them. And so part of what is our opportunity here today and going forward with implicit bias is, once we realize what is being perpetuated, only then can we try to stick a wrench in there and start to offset some of these traditional associations of black and threatening, or black and uneducated, or white and educated, or whatever, and try to, by something as simplistic as having police officers watch a video of Barack Obama and his family at a barbecue for a few minutes before they do their job, they become better police officers for the next 8 hours. And that's not as reported by them, that's as reported by the people they police, right? I mean, so some of these things, it's amazing. Like you say, simplistic, and we think of that as, I think often like a bad thing, but it's amazing. Some of this stuff works, it'd be great if you believed that it was going to work organically, but with implicit bias, you don't really have to believe it's going to work. As long as you start to do it, it's going to work, and your attitudes are going to follow.
So do we see this showing up? Clearly, we're talking about individual behavior, but does it also show up in some systemic way? I mean, does it impact some of the larger issues that people have to struggle with in life?
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever we're talking about systemic racism or sexism or systemic anything, that has to just be the end result of a big collection of individual decisions, right? I mean, that's what all these things are, and so this stuff always runs the risk of being so abstract all the time that I really love examples that really bring it home of what we're talking about. And so at the extreme end of what you're talking about in systemic is one of the leading automated soap dispensing companies in the United States a few years ago, I won't say who, they came out with a new model, and it turns out that the model was about 5 times less capable of recognizing black hands than it was white hands. And so it turns out if you're in a room and you're a bunch of white engineers, said, all right, good to go, okay, so and you send it off to market, because you don't realize that the sensing technology that you're using is not geared toward other than white hands. So there's all these videos online of, you and I were going to wash our hands, and it's easy for me, and you're going, and it's not working, right? This faucet can't be racist, but then again, it can be racist, right? I mean, so that's one example of how this stuff can make it all the way through without anybody questioning it, without anybody saying, wait a minute. And so when it comes to systemic things, everything from the classroom to the courtroom to business culture everywhere has degrees of what we're talking about. And it's, again, because from such an early age, we are inundated with a lot of, like you said earlier, a need to put people into buckets, to boxes, and categorize, because we need that desire to we don't like things unresolved. And so we need to be able to put people in this particular box, and if it doesn't line up with what we think it's supposed to look like, we often don't like that. And that's part of what we do in the exhibit in the learning lab, is getting across to people that being uncomfortable has many different functions. One of them that gets overlooked is the being uncomfortable is, in a sense, your brain's way of saying, I'm not used to dealing with this. Let's. I don't want to deal with this. Let's just stop doing it, whatever it is, right? It's. I tell people to really do some introspection, and the next time that the courtesy caller interrupting dinner has a thick accent, if they find themselves more frustrated than if the person doesn't, why? You don't know this person. And again, it's thick accent. Your brain is or accent that is different than your own. Your brain is labeling, I don't want to have to deal with what this guy's saying, so I'm just going to not like it, as opposed to you genuinely disliking it, and then, right? So it's some of this stuff is counterintuitive, and so it's definitely it has to be learned, and it's coming from somewhere. To your point, so.
And I think that what's important about this is because, and I'm going to say something that many people probably would find probably very unpopular. I get tired of people throwing around whether this is racist or not. It's an oversimplification of some very complex things that go on, because now we're seeing that, wait a minute, people also are being treated differently based on their race, if they're Muslim or they're identified with something other. It's always the other. You other than what I believe you should be, based on whatever, based on gender, based on religion, based on race or color of skin, whatever it is. What we keep saying is, how do we identify other? Because the world should look like me. People begin to basically think the world should look like me, and people should believe as I believe and behave as I want you to behave, etc. So it's a complex, very complex issue to me, because it's broader than it's not just about the color of my skin, it's what that means in your world. That why is it that the color of my skin makes you want to treat me differently? Why is it the fact that my faith is different from yours makes you want to treat me differently? So I think it's just so complex, and as soon as people say, oh, this is about racism, it becomes a conversation to me that's too stilted.
Totally.
As opposed to a broader conversation. So
at the beginning of the program, you said a version of what I'm about to say, which is, I think, to keep in mind that there's a lot more that unites us than divides us, right? And that's an Aaron Sorkin West Wing line, but the sense of it is pure. I firmly believe there are about 1,000 direct similarities between any two random people on Earth. But if you have a different skin tone, different gender, different accent, human beings are hardwired to spot difference, right? And so it shouldn't matter that you're a woman or black or Muslim, but these things often register, and to pretend like they don't can get in the way of getting to those connections that we're talking about, right? Because, and only when you can start to have empathy with these groups do you start to realize kind of what we're getting at, because the root of fear and is uncertainty. When you don't know about something, it's going to remain something you don't like and are anxious about. And so part of what we're talking about in here is being able to recognize these so-called blind spots and realize that, like you said, it is a lot more complicated, and it's these behaviors aren't going to correct themselves on their own, right? We have to be very intentional about trying to offset some of the historical barriers that we've developed over the generations. And some of the one example that I use often with kids and adults is the author Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? So wrote a book a couple years ago, Between the World and Me, shortlisted for the Pulitzer, and then he won a MacArthur Genius Grant within like a year. And then he teamed up with Marvel, just to revive this comic, Black Panther, which was started and stopped in the early '60s. And like we were talking about earlier, it's about to be Halloween again. When you start going shopping for costumes, or just look around and start to see the sheer number of negative costumes that are black and the positive ones that are white, and you're going to start to get an idea of what we're talking about, right? So Ta-Nehisi Coates for adults and older kids, Between the World and Me, his book, for young kids reading Black Panther, so it is not it's not nearly as difficult for when they become 32, when they become my age. It's going to be a lot easier for them to make that automatic association between black and intelligent, black and smart, black and wealthy, black and whatever. And that's at the core of what we talk about a lot at the Freedom Center in Open Your Mind. The experience, the exhibit is that while it'd be great if we could just get rid of all these negative associations that we have, there's not a lot of evidence that says that we can just get rid of them. But what we can do is start to increase the positive associations and make it easier to get to, we keep talking about just race, but like you were saying, that can, for any number of reasons, the conversation as it pertains to race becomes very emotional and very threatening, and like you said, it can really derail an otherwise productive conversation in a way that I like to lead up to race by showing in ways that are non-threatening and non-emotional, and so and definitive, so that when we then get to nobody after 20 minutes having, okay, you all agreed on these 4 different aspects of the same thing. Now let me show you how the same thing turns out to be true when it comes to how we see race, and it becomes a lot more palatable for people. And getting these things into the Freedom Center, we have something like 40,000 school-age kids a year come through the Freedom Center. While I can't talk to all of them, we get a 10,000 probably through our lab in a calendar year. And just like anything that you can get into kids at an early age, an instrument, another language, sports, anything becomes easier to incorporate not only to their worldview, but it becomes amplified as they grow in a way that, just like anybody that's tried to learn an instrument or a sport or a language later in life, it's a heck of a lot harder than it was when you were a little kid and you just did it, because that's how the brain works. And so getting these ideas into kids as early and often, and it's exposing them to as much diversity as possible, not just because it's some just for the sake of doing it. Diverse, we are becoming a more diverse country, and that's not a bad thing. We need to leverage that aspect of our society.
Well, it's interesting too that people will often think or say, well, why are we still talking about this? Or why are people complaining about this? Things are better. But they also need to understand there's a financial impact that happens because of the implicit bias. That I was reading an article actually in preparation for it today, where they've done some interesting things at Ohio State, and one of the things they've looked at is how implicit bias plays into things like access to credit and housing patterns. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we're coming to race, these things are, the implicit bias will be thought of as like I'll backtrack. The most successful workshop that we've had with an organization to this point has been with the Cincinnati Board of Realtors, and they came to us several months ago and said that realtors play an outsized role in perpetuating segregation in the United States. We would like to learn how not to. And it's variously called steering or redlining, but if you and I contact the same realtor and all they have access to is Ryan Waynet, Ayanna Coles, my picture, your picture, we can be told very different neighborhoods to go toward or against, depending on that information. Now, that's discriminatory, that's illegal, but the Cincinnati Board of Realtors, of which 30 agencies are represented at this workshop, these people are not doing this just for the sake of doing it. They're doing it because they think that they can make more money by not treating people the way they're currently treating them, right? By not just jumping to these conclusions. And so being able to realize that how, realtors are the gatekeepers in the United States. They, in many ways, dictate who lives where and with whom and alongside whom. And just having this group within the span of 5 minutes, having realtors reel off their 30-second elevator pitch for various neighborhoods all in a row, right? Bond Hill, Hyde Park, Anderson, Roselawn, all these, you can very immediately tell that probably not within the same day or even the same week are they uttering these neighborhoods back to back. And it was really neat for, I think, them and eye-opening to see how different it would be depending on not only who they were talking about, but also if the neighborhood happened to be the neighborhood that the realtor grew up in. They would end up being biased in ways that they really didn't appreciate, how much they were pro-Turpin or pro-Sycamore or whatever. And so I think this stuff plays out everywhere. And so when it comes to also with credit and the financial markets, African Americans are targeted in ways that are undeniable. And when you start to look at the numbers of how throughout the South, Chapter 13, bankruptcy is the predominant way to go. The reason it's the only place in the country that it's the predominant way to go is because everywhere else in the country, Chapter 7 is the preferred thing, which is it costs a little bit more, but you get it done like this way.
Right.
With the other one, it ends up putting these people into these loops of they never end up paying it off,
Right.
et cetera, but they end up, the people will choose that option because the attorney will forego the fee.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, again, these things, and again, it's not trying to necessarily target these people because they're black. This is, again, a class thing. And it becomes even harder to separate these things because they compound on top of each other.
And it feels like we just got started on the conversation because this is such an important conversation. We could stay on this for a long time. Unfortunately, we already are at the point where which we're having to wrap it up. I can't believe that. I'm going to give you the last word, Ryan. Can we change this? Is that what we're trying to do with the Learning Lab? Can we make some progress?
Yes, I tell people every day that when I have little kids in there, and it's every day I have little kids, I always ask them, what weighs more? All the elephants in the world or all the ants? And all the little kids always say elephants, hands down. Ants outweigh all mammals about 200 to 1. It's not even close. We do not have an intuitive appreciation of how small things add up to big things and how simple individual contributions can combine to create really big, meaningful changes. And that's what we have the opportunity to do. We just got to go do it.
Thank you so much for tuning into Knowledge is Power. Please visit the Learning Lab at the Underground Railroad Freedom Center. Ryan would be more than happy to go through some of the activities that they do there once you go to the Freedom Center. We always appreciate you joining us for what we hope was an interesting and informative discussion. And thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.